Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lecture of ancient societies, the first one after the midterm. So we've been talking about domestication and the emergence of sedentary groups in the New World in the last lecture, and thinking about how lifestyles change and such. Today, I want to talk a little bit about another theme, which is the building of monuments and the emergence of inequality. And the area that we're going to use as kind of a case study, so we're going to learn a little bit about the prehistory of this area in very broad strokes while we examine this theme, is the southeastern US. So here in Louisiana, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about things in Louisiana, but also along the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Basin. And this is a theme that really fits in between the emergence of agriculture and the Mesolithic and all of that, and complex civilizations. So the organization of this lecture essentially is, first, we're going to think about some concepts and themes broadly. So what are monuments and monumentality? Also, what is inequality? And we're going to consider what we can tell from the archaeology of each of these subjects and how we can see inequality and what monuments tell us. Then we're going to talk about Middle Archaic mounds in Louisiana. So some of the earliest mounds and who built them and why and what they tell us about these early societies. And then finally, we're going to talk about actually both woodland and later Mississippian chiefdoms. And principally, we'll talk about Cahokia, but we'll touch on some earlier and some later stuff as well. And the whole arc of this story essentially is thinking about why people build monuments. So these are people that are known as the mound building peoples. And there's been a lot of mystery around them in the past and such, but they're getting better and better understood by archaeology. And I'd say there's mystery because, in the late 19th century and the 20th century as well, there are lots of speculation about who were building these mounds and what did they mean. And there are large earthen mounds in the US, essentially from Ohio in the north and even Michigan down here into Louisiana and Florida, Arkansas, and all these points in between. So what do these mounds mean and who made them? And there's a major sort of story of change that includes developing inequality and shifting meaning of these mounds in the southeastern US. And that's really what we're going to be exploring in this lecture. So in terms of broad sort of conceptual themes, one is, what is a monument and why do people build monuments and mounds? Another one is, how does unequal social relations develop? That's kind of secondary to this question of monumentality. And finally, how does hereditary leadership develop? So these are all things we're going to touch on. Essentially, when we're talking about monumentality, this is the building of large-scale and durable constructions by communities. These are, by definition, features that are too big to be built by an individual or a small family. So these are features that need many people to come together to build them. And we can think about what types of features these are and why a little bit more as we think about the reasons for why monuments are built. And I say one thing that building monuments does, it's a byproduct, maybe as much as a reason, is by working together, the very act of working together and cooperating helps to solidify shared identities. So people working side by side with the same goal creates a community, it creates a team, we could say. So we can think about people in ancient Egypt, for example, pulling stone blocks up the ramps up the pyramids. And there is an argument, we'll get to this when we talk about Egypt in a couple classes, that the building of the pyramids was one of the ways in which Egyptian pharaonic society was built in the first place. So building things, it reunites people together for common goals, and creates shared identities. So you have this experience that you all worked on, this project that you cooperated in. Now, what kinds of projects? Why are you making these projects in the first place? They're usually practical or religious purposes to monuments. Monuments can be things like city walls or irrigation canals that serve practical purposes, and are durable and large. And they can also often be things like temples and religious adorations of sorts. So these could be temple mounds and the temples themselves. They could be things like large scale, what's the word? So I'm thinking like large scale images that are visible from space. So the Nazca lines, for example, come to mind for this. We'll talk about those a little bit in the future as well. But essentially, they were people who made images of animals and such out of rocks in the desert. And these are images we can still see today. Those are monuments as well, that were built for religious purposes. So there are practical or religious uses for these monuments as well. They serve a use for the community, or for important individuals within the community. And this is something that may unite people together in for the goal of creating these things. And then finally, in some cases, though not all cases, these monuments celebrate the accomplishments and status of an individual. So the classic example of this on a broad comparative scale are the pyramids. So the pyramids of Giza and Egyptian pyramids. These were built for the pharaohs, for the rulers, and also for important members of society. But the largest and most impressive ones were built to celebrate the pharaohs, who were essentially god kings. And other types of monuments, ranging from large statues to other types of tombs and such, are often built to celebrate individuals. So those are some of the motivations why. These don't always all have to go together. What's interesting, though, for our archaeologists is monuments, they represent fossilized uses of energy or expenditures of energy. So it takes a certain amount of labor to build any given structure. And we can start to figure out how much labor was put into a monument or a structure using different formulas and calculations. And so, and these formulas and calculations are derived from modern day experimental archaeology. So for example, with the pyramids of Giza, there were experiments where modern workmen, they quarried rocks for the pyramids, they pulled them on sleds, they shaped them, and they did all the steps that were necessary, even built a small pyramid out of rocks the shape of the pyramids of Giza. And there was somebody who was recording how many hours it took to take and how many people were working together for each of these steps. And so you can tabulate that all up, and you can come up with an estimate for how many people hours it takes to build a given thing. Of course, the more complicated the thing, the more steps and different tabulations you have to put together. But what we find archaeology often are the remains of something that was built, and we can get a pretty good idea of how big it was and what it was and such. So monuments, they represent a fossilized expenditure of energy. Now, this doesn't mean that we can tell exactly how many people built something. So, or we can tell exactly how long it took to build that monument. Just because we know how much energy it took, there may be multiple solutions to that puzzle. So, if there were 100,000 people hours that went into a monument, on one extreme, there could be one person who spent 100,000 hours making it. On the other extreme, there could be 100,000 people who spent an hour each making it. Now, likely the solution is somewhere in the middle, but it's hard to say looking at a monument itself. But those estimates of labor, they give us some rough idea about the size of communities, about the labor that those communities were able to mobilize and such. And that tells us something important about ancient societies and ancient peoples. So how well were they able to work together towards shared goals, and what and how complex also were the steps necessary to create those shared goals. So on one extreme, when we talk about complexity, often for building earthen mounds, all that's really needed is a bunch of people who can carry baskets of soil or earth to a given area, and also people who can compact them. This is a really easy thing to do. We could all go build an earthen mound if we really wanted to. It takes relatively little coordination and relatively little specialized knowledge. But when we're talking about more complex monument, so think about a Maya pyramid, for example, there are multiple different types of people that are working together to build it. There are people that are cutting stone blocks, and there are people that are making a rubble fill out of other stone, and there are people that are mixing and making stucco to paint the exterior. There are people that are painting it. There are all kinds of things going on. That sort of more complex construction project usually can give us an indication that this was created by a complex society, because when we have people with specialized knowledge contributing to a project, and also when it's necessary to coordinate between those people, it's more likely that there's a centralized authority that is telling people what to do. So the complexity of a project, what types of different steps went into it, can give us some idea about the society that built that project as well. Now, another topic we'll talk about that I mentioned earlier are the social inequality. And there's really two main types of inequality that manifest themselves in both modern and ancient societies. And when we're talking about inequality, this means unequal political power, often unequal access to economic resources as well. There's something referred to as achieved status, and this is essentially when individuals gain a special status through their own qualities and characteristics during their lifetime. So, for example, somebody might be a really great speaker and know how to inspire others, or they might be really good at trading or really industrious or whatever else. And through their own abilities, they gain special status throughout the course of their lifetime. They're not born with that status, they gain it through their qualities. So that's why it's called achieved status. Ascribed status, in contrast, is a society where you are born into a certain social status. So there may be chiefs and there may be commoners, or there may be different classes of nobility, and you are born into that class through an artifact of your family or your lineage usually, and you get special status and treatment because of your birth and because of your identity in relationship to that family. So either you're a commoner or you are a chief or noble. So how can we see inequality archaeologically? One of the principal areas where it's often easiest to see whether or not inequality exists is through domestic architecture. So we can talk about different sized houses that have different quality of material going into them. That's something that's quite easy to see archaeologically. That's certainly something I've looked at myself in my own work. We can look at also the differences in the location and access to important resources of houses. So is that house located in the central plaza of a city, or is it located way far away from there? That tells us something about status as well. Or is there even a central plaza or a richer quarter to be located within? We can also look at burials, for example, and we can look at the difference in quality of value and value of burial goods. So what types of goods are individuals buried with across society? Are they all the same, or are there some individuals who have more things and better things than others? Now, if we want to identify ascribed status, or a status that you're born into with some confidence, often what archaeologists look for are young children that are buried with high value goods. So when they're young children or infants especially, there's very little possibility for them to have achieved status through their lifetime. And we can suggest maybe that they are buried in such a way because they're part of a prominent family. We can also look at differences in the quality of material and location of tombs as well. So the size and the style of the structures or the burials themselves where people are buried, that can tell us something about inequality. Sometimes if they're monuments, so statues or tombs that are large tombs that are built for individuals, that tells us that inequality is present and sometimes great degrees of inequality. And also we can look at the trash and goods buried in specific houses. So are there variations in the types of food people are eating, with some more prestigious foods being consumed in higher quantities in some households than others? And we can also look at the pottery or the stone tools that are buried, and are there more fine decorated stone tools in the trash in some houses than others, or fine decorated pottery vessels, I should say. So there are a lot of different ways we can approach this question archaeologically. But a question that we can ask ourselves, and I think this lecture partially addresses, is how closely are monument building and inequality linked? Do you need to have an unequal society for monuments to be built? And importantly, work here in the southeastern United States is contributing to a body of work that suggests that you do not, that more egalitarian, relatively equal, mobile societies are capable of building large-scale monuments. Now, the question always is going to be, what kinds of monuments are they? And again, there are different types of monuments, and some are more specialized that require more different types of people working together, and some are simpler to build as well. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about culture in the southeastern US, and specifically some of the earliest and first mounds that are built in this region. And when we talk about the southeastern US, it's really dominated in part, and a lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of these cultures is dominated by the Mississippi watershed. This watershed actually drains 2/3 of the country. Of course, when we talk about the Southeast, there are areas that are outside of the watershed itself. But one thing that is really special about the US that we don't see in all parts of the world, so we don't see it in Mexico, for example, in Central America where I work, is the US is blessed with lots and lots of navigable rivers that are transportation and trade corridors. And the Mississippi system is one of the largest of all of these corridors. And it certainly was something that indigenous people used in the past as well. And these navigable rivers were used for as sources of food, but also just for moving easily and rapidly over large areas of the region. And there are also varied types of terrain with different qualities. There are lots of different types of resources, different types of stone that were used for stone tools and stone decorations. There's even sources of copper and mica that indigenous people used. And there's varied topography and different environments that have different types of resources, ranging from marine resources to mountain to mountain environments. When we talk about the archaeology of the US on the most broad scale, we can divide it into 4 time periods. There's the Paleo-Indian time period, which is from essentially the inhabitants or the occupancy of the US, the continental US. Of course, the US doesn't exist way back, but that could go back now all the way to 23,000 years ago, all the way to 8,000 years ago. Then we have the Archaic period, which lasts from about 8,000 years ago to 800 years ABC, 800 years. It's not 8,000 years ago, but 8,000 BC to 800 BC. And then after that, there's the Woodland, which is 800 BC to AD 1,100 about. And then the Mississippian is the final one, which is 1,200 to 15 or 1600 essentially, so the historic period. We're going to be talking specifically about the Archaic period first, and really the emergence of some really early precocious earthen mounds during the Archaic period. And for some context, these mounds are actually older than the pyramids of Egypt. They're quite old, and people didn't believe that such ancient monuments existed in North America until the late 90s, essentially, when these some of these sites were dated. And there's a group of about 11 major mound sites or so that are from what's referred to as the Middle Archaic period. They're found in Louisiana on the Mississippi Valley. So this is a rich environment. When we think about swamps, we don't necessarily think about them as places that we want to be, despite the fact that swamps are all around us. But swamps are incredibly rich environments. There are a variety of waterfowl, fish, and animals, as well as lots of different plants that you can consume. And this rich environment seems to have supported complex hunter-gatherer societies earlier in Louisiana than in other parts of the US, so relatively early. And things like oxbows, for example, are especially rich environments that were used by early Louisianian indigenous groups. So these were mobile hunter-gatherers. They were primarily fishing and hunting and gathering wildly, growing foods. In fact, what's interesting about Louisiana is it really only started farming, or its people really only started farming relatively late. And that might be because the environment was so naturally abundant with wild foods. So I believe you see the first farming in the Mississippian period, so around AD 1100 in Louisiana. But these mobile hunter-gatherer people, they were able to build some earthen mound complexes that are still preserved today. And one of the earliest of these complexes that we've dated to so far is a site called Watson's Break, or Watson Break. And it was occupied from about 3,500 BC, or over 5,500 years ago, until 3000 BC. It's located in northern Mississippi, along the Watson Bayou, and it's made up of 12 earthen mounds, with the tallest of them being 25 feet tall. These were not built overnight. These were not one distinct construction project. And this is something to consider when we talk about pyramids and mounds and all of this. These were earthen platforms or mounds that were built in multiple phases over a 500-year period. So people were continually revisiting this area. It may be that they had seasonal camps around Watson Break. This seems like an especially rich area, and so they may have been able to stay there for part of the year. And they were able to build over the generations these mounds that were as tall as 25 feet tall. When we talk about the artifacts, there's really not a lot of artifacts we find at Watson Break and the other 10 or so regional sites. They're not any hearths, or there's not posts and evidence of permanent housing. These people were camping around these mounds. There's no pottery. Pottery was not invented in North America in 3,500 BC yet. And there's certainly no domesticated crops. There were bones and such of deer and waterfowl and such, but they were not taking care of plants yet at this point. What we do find mostly are things like fire-cracked rocks. And so early Louisiana Native American people, one of the ways that they cooked was by creating baskets or bags out of leaves and filling those with water, and then they'd heat rocks to high temperatures in fires, and they would use something to grab the rocks, put them in the baskets or the bags that they created, and boil water that way. And so that was a way to make soups and to boil foods and such. So we find fire-cracked rocks at Watson Break, and we also find different archaic arrowheads for hunting and such, and stone tools. And there are 10 other Middle Archaic sites that are found in the lower Mississippi Basin, as well as Watson Break. But Watson Break is really the most famous of them. What do these sites tell us about social organization and mound building? These were mounds that were built by mobile egalitarian foragers. There's no evidence of inequality. There's no evidence that they were living there year round. Yet there were communities that still were able to come together to create these earthen structures. And they were building them with baskets, moving earth with baskets and such. This is a technique. It really doesn't require a lot of organization. It doesn't require a lot of specialized knowledge. You dig earth, you put it in a basket, you bring it to where you want the mound to be. Usually you want to compact or ram that earth. But this is something that lots of people could contribute to without a lot of direction. Everybody could go out and get the earth that they wanted to get for the day, add it on top of the mound, and you can build a mound that way. And when we think about the fact that these were built over 500 years and there are many different layers of construction, we're not talking about a task that was especially difficult any given year for any given group of people, or maybe not necessarily a task that needed loads and loads of people either. We're talking about something that gradually grew over time, over many people's lifetimes. And this was an area that was continually revisited. Probably it was a seasonal camp. And again, because it's close, it's around, it's in a high points with swamps around it, it's close to a river, and all. So this was a rich place. What do these mounds represent? It's hard to say for sure. Obviously, we don't have any writing or anything that can tell us what these people were thinking, but they may well be for religious ceremonies or such. That's kind of the fallback answer for archaeology. But there seems like there is a regular circular shape that was created in the landscape. When we talk about pyramids and mounds and such, one thing that's fairly universal, I'll point out, is often they imitate hills or mountains. Sometimes they can also have practical uses, especially here in southeastern Louisiana. If we remember thinking about southeastern Louisiana and thinking about Louisiana particularly, this is new land and this is swampy land. And so creating mounds can give some degree of flood protection. So there are practicalities as well, though with these people, it's doubtful that that's the primary goal. Some other early mounds that are elsewhere in the US that are just worth mentioning briefly, just to make the point that mounds are built multiple ways. There are lots of coastal shell mounds, and some of them are quite old as well. Some of them in Florida. There's a number in Florida on the coast of the Carolinas as well, and Georgia. These shell mounds are not necessarily actively planned in the same way that earthen mounds are. Essentially, shell mounds are giant trash heaps. They're the accretion of shells that are being consumed by indigenous people over large periods of time, sometimes even hundreds of years. And they can grow quite tall, quite large. They can be used for other things later, but they really start out as a trash heap. And because they're giant trash heaps, they can be quite useful for understanding a lot of things about indigenous people, about their diet, and usually often they throw other things in as well as just the shells. So there are these shell middens or shell mounds as well, but they're kind of different than the other earthen mounds we're going to be talking about today. There's a collapse after about 3000 BC of mound building that kind of calms down, only to be continued in Louisiana and Louisiana, Mississippi, and into Arkansas about 1700 BC or 2700 years ago. And the groups that continue this tradition are known as the Poverty Point cultures. There are multiple sites like Poverty Point itself and Jigtown that are quite important for our understanding of this. Poverty Point in particularly is very impressive. So it's a Louisiana mound site. It's located in northeastern Louisiana. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. And it is located on bluffs along the river, essentially. So it's a advantageous spot. There's lots of swamps and lots of resources that are near it. And it's known for having the second largest Native American mound that is that's known from the US. It's massive. So Mound A at Poverty Point is over 72 feet tall, with a significant area as well. It's not just tall, but it spreads over a large area. Poverty Point is known for having a plaza that was artificially filled to make it flat, that has a lot of post holes that might create a circular enclosure with the post holes as well within the plaza. So there is a large earthen pyramid that probably imitates a mountain. There's a flattened out plaza with posts in it. We don't know exactly what the posts are used for. And there's also these slightly enigmatic circular ridges all around the plaza with the major mounds. There are a few different tall mounds, one in the middle of the plaza and the other ones outside around the circular ridges. There's some debate about what these ridges are. So there have been excavations of the ridges, and there have been post holes that have been found. Some people suggest that these ridges were where a permanent sedentary population of highly complex foragers lived, while other people suggest that this is an area where people were camping seasonally. And there's lots of back and forth between the experts. I think that it might well be a permanent settlement because there's a lot of artifacts and a lot of trash at the site. But that's something that's yet to be completely decided. Again, these are complex foragers. There's no evidence of domesticated plants at the site. They're eating fish from the rivers and hunting and eating wildly gathered foods. There's some crude pottery at the site, but there's more of these objects referred to as PPOs, or Poverty Point objects. They're slightly enigmatic. These are hardened clay objects, sometimes baked clay objects. One theory that I've heard for what these PPOs are that I think makes a lot of sense is maybe they are like those fire hard cracked rocks. They're things that were heated to heat up to boil water in perishable baskets and in bags and such. Now, in addition to this, we see imported exotic objects from all over the Mississippi Basin, including copper from the Great Lakes area and Galena, and these fascinating soapstone objects. And so none of these stones are local to the area, and they were brought into Poverty Point. Soapstone is famous for being one of the softest types of stone. It's really easy to fashion into objects, including bowls. And so these are some soapstone bowls that were found at the site of Claiborne, I guess, which is another early Poverty Point site. But there are all kinds of exotic objects found at Poverty Point. There are these possible houses. So this tells us that society in some ways is changing, and there's more regional links. They're getting more complex in the material culture. There's some pottery, but not a lot. And this is a society that is capable of building very large scale monuments. They are definitely built by complex sedentary foragers. There are no structures that have been found on top of the mounds. Maybe they're religious structures. Maybe they're meant to imitate some sort of formation. So maybe on mountains or hills or whatever else. They, like Watson Brake, they were built gradually over 600 years. So there's not necessarily, this is much more impressive than Watson Brake. 72 feet, again, is the second tallest indigenous mound that was built in the southeastern US. But they're still built gradually as well. So the site was built over time. And this was a site that attracted a lot of exotic goods from all over the Mississippi drainage. There's no evidence of inequality between the residents of the site. When we look at there's no burials in the mounds, there's no major differences in the housing. So it seems like this was still an egalitarian society. One possible interpretation I might hazard to forward is maybe this was some sort of pilgrimage site. Maybe that's the reason why we find exotic goods from all over at Poverty Point. But it is a really fascinating place nonetheless. It's a place I've been meaning to go visit. I haven't been able to go yet, but it's a place I've been meaning to go visit, and it's really important in the prehistory of Louisiana and also the U.S. more broadly. So the point of this being, Louisiana has a lot of really important, really neat stuff that's pertinent to the history of the prehistory of the U.S. But we're still talking, when we talk about Poverty Point, there's probably similar goals. Either they're trying to recreate a landscape, or they're creating sacred mountains to have ceremonies on top of, or whatever else for the mound building at Poverty Point. Finally, we're going to talk about woodland and then Mississippian mounds. After the fall of Poverty Point, mound building dies down in Louisiana for a while. We really see some of the most fascinating mounds built along the Mississippi drainage, but a lot of things, especially in Ohio. And there are a couple, these come along as well with the advent of domestication. So after the advent, so some domestication happens as early as 4,000 years ago here in the continental US. However, the earliest domesticates that people were eating here were things like amaranth, sunflower seeds, marsh elder, and chenopodium. So here's some different pictures. So these are all grasses that can be eaten, and they're not as productive as wheat or corn or rice. So these were ground up into flours, and they made cakes and things out of them. And people that were growing these plants, along with other things like fiddlehead ferns and such, were over time built mounds as well. And some of the most famous mound cultures in the woodland period are the Adena and Hopewell cultures, and they last from about 200 BC through 8500. We begin to see some signs of social stratification and differentiation that they deal with the Adena and Hopewell spheres. The Adena, or the Hopewell sphere, it reaches all the way to Louisiana, to Marksville. It's a site with a museum you can go visit in Marksville, Louisiana. I've been there myself. I actually did a project on Hopewell stuff, or I helped on a project on Hopewell stuff outside of Marksville at a place called Loch St. Agnes that has a mound as well. But that Louisiana is a part of this, but it's kind of a peripheral part of this, with a real center of some of the neatest sites in Ohio and Indiana and such. And Hopewell people and Adena people, they were known for creating things like effigy mounds. So they're mounds that look like snakes and like lizards and such. They were importing fancy exotic materials, and they were creating burial mounds. A lot of those burial mounds are what is known as charnel houses, and these were areas where groups were cremated. But there are some burial mounds that include the burial of individuals, some of which have a lot of fancy things. And so there's some suggestion that there's emerging inequality during the Hopewell and Adena, in Hopewell and Adena sites during the woodland periods in the US. But it's not clear whether this is hereditary inequality or achieved inequality. And we find things like copper from the Great Lakes. So copper, you can just excavate it on its own. We find these mica cutouts. This is a famous type of artifact from Hopewell sites. So that claw over there. So they're exotic things as well. And again, they're using the river. It was easy for them to travel around over long distances in canoes and such. And so they were getting exotic goods from far away and bearing them with important people. What really seems to revolutionize society in the continental US and southeastern US, though, is the arrival of corn out in the southeastern US. Corn first arrives in the US in the desert area, so in Arizona and Four Corners region and such. The story of corn's domestication is an interesting one. We talked about it a bit already, but after domestication, people had to adapt corn to more and more environments. And specifically, one of the big adaptations that was created, or variants that was created, were more cold resistance variants of corn, and that took a while. And so only once there were cold resistant variants of corn could people really start to plant corn in the Southeast and throughout the Americas. And within a few hundred years of the domestication of corn, or the use of corn in the southeastern US, we start to see some major developments in mound building. One of the most prominent of these is the site of Cahokia, which is actually the largest settlement that was ever built in the continental US prior to the arrival of Europeans. Cahokia is made up of over 120 mounds. It is near modern day St. Louis in the American Bottoms region of the Mississippi Plain. It was a site that covered 6 square miles, and it had a population of between 16,000 and 20,000 people at its height. So Cahokia was practically a city, and it rivaled some cities of Europe in terms of population and size, if these estimates are to be believed. At the center of Cahokia was Monk's Mound. This is an earthen mound that is 100 feet tall and covers 13 acres. So if we think about labor and labor estimates, Monk's Mound would have taken significant amounts of labor to build. And considering that this was a site that was really only inhabited for about 200 years, its creation is all the more impressive. So there were lots of people working together to create this massive earthen mound. Another major shift and change with Monk's Mound and other Mississippian mounds was their use. And so we talked about burial mounds and effigy mounds previously, but a lot of Mississippian mounds were used to house the residence of important people. And so on top of Monk's Mound and on top of other mounds in the Mississippian period, we find wattle and daub structures with really nice artifacts and such around them that suggest that they were the residences of chiefs. And so we go from it's just kind of this transformation where, you know, mounds are these communal projects for religious rites, probably early on in the archaic period. We have a lot of that still in the woodland period, but we also start to see burial mounds. If we think about what the meaning of burial mounds are, if there are a group that are buried in the burial mound, that's to honor a group. But once we start seeing individuals buried in burial mounds there, that's really about honoring individuals. And in the Mississippian period at Cahokia and later sites, what we're seeing are earthen mounds that are built as the bases for residences of elite peoples and chiefs. So this is another use of these mounds. And this, it goes from communal projects with religious goals towards communal projects in the service of glorifying individuals. So people are working together to glorify their leaders, to support their leaders, we could say. When we talk about Cahokia as well as Monk's Mound and some of the other large mounds, we have evidence of palisade that surrounded the core of the site. And this is a reconstruction of what that palisade may have looked like. We don't know if it was built for defensive purposes or privacy or what. There's some weird things, like there's a wood henge that was built in one part of Cahokia. We found the post holes. These may have been used to tell time for astronomy. And we find the burial, incredibly rich burials of individuals. So there's an individual who's known as Birdman, who is buried in Mound 72 of Cahokia. And he is buried on top of a cape that was made out of thousands of shells. This was something that, so he's buried in a large burial mound that took significant labor by himself, and he's wearing a cape with lots of shells. And that makes some people think that this was maybe a chief or a leader at Cahokia. And we see exotic items of even higher quality from throughout the Mississippi drainage. So these range from copper items to soapstone carvings, like the individual who's playing a game called Chunky to the left. This was a game that indigenous people played, and the copper, we're seeing warriors with clubs and such. There's also fascinating evidence of migration into Cahokia from outside. So we see new types of structures. that were and mixed structures that were built in regional styles that are built in Cahokia. And we also see these structures moving out from Cahokia to surrounding areas. So they're mixes of new styles of building and old artifacts and vice versa that suggest that people are migrating into the region. Cahokia collapses around 1350, and after that, very quickly, it seems like the Mississippian tradition that starts at Cahokia disperses out into the Mississippi River drainage to a number of different mound sites all the way to Louisiana. Now, why did Cahokia decline after 8350? Nobody really knows for sure. Of course, we don't have written records from Cahokia, but things like the wall suggest maybe there was warfare and factional competition. There may be climate change, though I don't know how strong evidence is for that. There's some people that have also suggested that there's overuse of the land. Maybe there's too much deforestation and erosion, things like that. But in any case, Cahokia declines and collapses. And a pattern that we'll mention and that you'll read about with your readings is a pattern of unstable chiefdoms that last a few hundred years and then collapse and then are founded again elsewhere. And this seems to be the pattern for Cahokia. So that after Cahokia falls, the styles of houses and the types of mound, including these chiefly mounds, spread throughout the Southeast US, as I was saying, and new sites like Moundville are built that are impressive, but not nearly as impressive as Cahokia. These tend to be smaller with smaller populations. Places like Etowah, Moundville, Spiro have mixes of chiefly residential mounds, burial mounds, and such, and were centers of power for regional chiefdoms. And this cycle with these sites being occupied for a few hundred years and then collapsing and being abandoned seems to repeat itself all the way up until when the Southeast US is colonized. And here are some of the other important ones. So as I said, Moundville, Etowah, Spiro, Gibson Clunk Mound. These are just a few. So what do we see over time with monument building and how monuments are used? The earliest archaic mounds don't have structures in top. I'd suggest that they may be religious. Maybe they're emulating or copying hills. Maybe they're creating some kind of religious landscape. A point to make about all of these sites, especially some of the later ones, is there is a filling in of the plazas that's just as important as the building the mounds themselves. So oftentimes they modify the landscape to create a flat plaza surface. And the earliest mounds are built by hunter-gatherers that are mobile. The later Poverty Point Mound versus Watson Break, they may be sedentary, though there's some debate about that. When we talk about the woodland mounds, they don't have structures on top either. Some of them, there are effigies of animals and such. They create geometric shapes, and there's some suggestion at some of these sites that there may have been processions that went along the mounds or through the mounds in some sort of ritual. There are, however, burial mounds that we find in the beginning, and at many sites they seem to have been communal burials, but there are some individuals that may be elite individuals. We don't know if they achieved that status over their lifetime or not. And there are group burials in these charnel pits. And then finally with Mississippian mounds, they seem to become chiefly residences as well. So chiefs build their houses on top of these large mounds. And there's sometimes also burials. But it seems like with the archaic mounds, especially, these were built slowly. Some of the woodland mounds were built in multiple phases as well. And maybe the Mississippian mounds were built a little more rapidly. And especially mounds like Monk's Mound at Cahokia, they represent major expenditures of energy. They took hundreds of people or thousands of people, significant amount of time to make. And mounded sites later on especially become the centers or the hubs of chiefdoms, of regional chiefdoms. And so what you see in the Southeast is often you see large mound sites with smaller sites with maybe a singular mound around them. And that leads people to think that there's a regional settlement hierarchy or a regional hierarchy of where people are living and why. So what does this tell us about mound building and the building of early monuments? Mounds can be built, or monuments can be built by mobile hunter-gatherer peoples. Building earthen mounds specifically is not really that complicated, though you do need to think a little bit about packing and ramming the earth in its exact shape so it doesn't erode away. This is a way to create and maintain group identities, and it's probably in the creation of religious monuments. But over time, as society becomes more complex, these same processes, these same group processes can be co-opted by chiefs and elites, maybe first as burials, and these burials may start as group burials. Maybe then it shrinks down to a family, an important family, and then it shrinks down to individuals. But these mounds are ultimately claimed as the residences and burials of important people as time progresses in the Mississippian. And again, this is all useful, I think, in a broader, more comparative sense for thinking about how societies develop, how inequality develops, and how monument making can play a role in that. So egalitarian societies can make monuments, and they do make monuments in some parts of the world. But over time, this can be co-opted, monument making can be co-opted by the powerful as a way of further augmenting their own status and power. So that's it for me for today, and I'll see, we'll talk with the next lecture.